Karen called the police when my wife challenged our HOA fine, convinced she had finally won. This neighbor, who had been tormenting us for weeks, seemed sure she had us cornered. When the officer arrived, he carefully reviewed Karen's so-called evidence and at first looked ready to arrest my wife, but then he asked for her ID. A few seconds of tense silence followed. The officer's face drained of color. "The broken bar, General Blake?" he whispered. Karen's smug grin vanished instantly. That moment changed everything forever. It had started on what should have been a perfect Saturday morning in our quiet Florida neighborhood. I was relaxing on the porch with a cold beer, watching Rachel tend to her garden. She looked like any suburban mama, hair tied back, old army t-shirt on, completely at ease. No one would guess this woman had once commanded 3,000 soldiers. Her roses stood in perfect rows, and even the mulch borders looked as neat as a military formation. That's when I first noticed our new neighbor, Megan. Something about her felt off. She slowed as she walked past our yard, phone held up like she was on a call, but her eyes were scanning our property with the precision of a drone on reconnaissance. Then, in a bizarre move, she pulled a small ruler from her pocket and crouched near our boundary line, measuring with obsessive focus. 2 hours later, an official-looking envelope appeared in our mailbox with the whole letterhead, designed to look more formal than most legal documents. Rachel opened it, her eyebrows shooting up like rockets. Inside were 3 violations, each citing obscure bylaws meant to confuse rather than clarify. $150 for planting native species not on the HOA's approved list, buried deep in some appendix we had never seen. $200 for grass height differences of more than half an inch, supposedly measured as 6 points across the lawn with ridiculous precision. $150 for a mulch border that extended barely a couple of inches past the property line. Total, $500. Justified as a pattern of multiple violations requiring immediate compliance. Each claim was accompanied by photographs, time-stamped to the minute, and measurements documented to the decimal point. It was absurdly meticulous, the kind of thing that felt more like intimidation than enforcement. Rachel studied the papers with the same look she once had when reviewing intelligence reports in Afghanistan. Then she stormed outside, where Megan was still on the sidewalk, clearly waiting to witness our reaction, holding up the violation notice. Rachel's voice carried the command of someone who had spent a career giving orders. This was nothing but targeted harassment disguised as community enforcement. Megan's reply was coated with condescension. She told Rachel that newer residents often need time to adjust to community standards and offered to explain the compliance process if Rachel was willing to learn from more experienced neighbors. That was the breaking point. After 20 years of military service, the challenges of retirement, and weeks of HOA games, Rachel snapped. She ripped the $500 citation clean in half, the sound echoing through the neighborhood. Then she ripped it again and again until the shredded pieces rained down like confetti at a victory parade. Megan's expression shifted from shock to something disturbingly close to delight, like Rachel had handed her exactly what she wanted. Rachel glared at her and said coldly, "There's your pattern of violations. Come back when you have legitimate citations based on rules normal people can actually follow." Megan's face flushed with a dozen emotions: of shock, anger, calculation. Before she whipped out her phone, frantically photographing every shred of paper, she muttered about destruction of official HOA documents and escalating hostility toward community governance. I knew right then we were in trouble. Still, it was strangely satisfying to watch my wife stand up to someone abusing fake authority. Yes, ripping up those papers in front of witnesses wasn't the smartest move, but there was beauty in her refusal to be bullied. Megan gathered every single scrap of the citation like it was crime scene evidence, her expression almost gleeful. The rest of that Saturday was tense, both of us waiting for the inevitable retaliation. Rachel spent the evening digging through Florida law and found that HOA violation notices weren't actually legal documents at all, more like invoices than anything enforceable in a criminal sense. The shredding might have felt good in the momenta and technically it wasn't illegal, but it gave Megan exactly the kind of dramatic evidence she needed to escalate things beyond a simple neighborhood squabble. By Sunday morning, she was back again, same slow, deliberate walk past our house, except this time she stopped. She wore the mask of a friendly neighbor, smiling warmly as if nothing had happened, and introduced herself as the president of the HOA. She asked how we were settling in, making small talk about our backgrounds, Rachel's military career, and the shift to civilian community life. But behind the smile, her eyes never stopped scanning it, taking in details, reactions, and even our word choices, like she was building a psychological profile for later use. When Rachel mentioned that she had studied the HOA citation process and planned to challenge the violations, Megan's reaction was the first red flag that we were in for more than petty neighborhood politics. Instead of brushing it off or getting defensive, her smile turned coldly professional. She calmly said she looked forward to Rachel's formal challenge. "Just be sure to follow all proper procedures for appeals and documentation," she added, stressing the words in a way that made it clear she knew exactly how difficult those procedures would be to navigate. That night I found Rachel at the kitchen table, laptop open and surrounded by printed regulations. She was buried in HOA bylaws, muttering about due process and procedural fairness, convinced she could dismantle Megan's tactics through discipline and detail. Watching her work, I had this sinking feeling she was preparing for the wrong kind of battle. Normal neighborhood disagreements don't require legal research that looks like prep work for congressional testimony. But something didn't add up. Why would a 15-year corporate lawyer bother playing HOA president? And that business card she'd casually mentioned to read legal service. So why did Megan seem so confident in what was about to happen? As week 2 began, Rachel still felt vindicated about tearing up that bogus citation, even if it meant whatever legal drama Megan was preparing to manufacture. Over the weekend, she had assembled what looked like a Supreme Court case, highlighting every procedural flaw Megan had made, carefully documenting how her shredding was justified. Florida's HOA laws were clear on notification requirements, appeals processes, and enforcement procedures had not been followed properly at all. Rachel approached it like a military operation, complete with detailed planning, checklists, and evidence organization. I admired her precision, though I worried it might be overkill. Tuesday morning was the hearing at our community center, and from the start it didn't look like the kind of neighborly meeting we'd expected. Most HOA hearings are held in someone's living room with folding chairs and a coffee pot in the corner, but this looked like a courtroom. A podium, official seating, even recording equipment. Megan arrived with a thick leather portfolio, dressed in a tailored business suit that probably cost more than a month's mortgage. She carried herself like someone who'd been preparing for this exact moment for far longer than a week. Rachel presented her case with military precision, citing Florida statutes on notification timelines, due process, and procedural violations that should have invalidated the entire citation process. She backed it up with evidence, precedents, and clear logic. The hearing officer, a weary-looking county employee named Johnson, listened carefully and admitted that Rachel's points about the notification timeline were valid. He seemed ready to rule in her favor until Megan spoke up. With a smooth voice, she asked permission to respond to what she called procedural concerns affecting community governance. That's when she dropped her first bombshell. Apologizing politely for any paperwork oversights, she casually mentioned that she should probably have broken bar. Megan then announced that, for the record, she should probably disclose her professional background. 15 years as a practicing attorney, specializing in real estate law, with extensive experience in HOA compliance and governance. She added, with a smooth edge, that she could clarify civilian legal requirements, since Rachel might be more familiar with military procedures than community administration. The effect was immediate and devastating. In a single moment, Rachel was no longer facing an overzealous volunteer with sloppy paperwork. She was up against a seasoned attorney who thrived in exactly this arena. Megan laid out corrected documentation that looked like it had come from a corporate law firm, certified mail receipts, complete with timestamps proving delivery, board meeting minutes signed by multiple witnesses, email trails showing that notices had been sent within the official 14-day window. It was all presented flawlessly, each piece dismantling Rachel's arguments one by one. I watched Rachel's confidence evaporate. Her careful case, built on procedural violations, collapsed as Megan revealed paperwork that seemed to have existed all along, hidden in systems she controlled. Johnson, the hearing officer, ruled that the HOA had followed proper procedure. The citations stood, and Rachel's shredding of the notice was framed as hostile destruction of official community documents. Outside, a crowd had gathered. News travels fast in neighborhoods, especially when someone dares to challenge authority. Our neighbors got front row seats to what looked like a masterclass in legal domination disguised as community leadership. Megan raised her voice just enough for them to hear, praising military service while stressing that civilian communities required cooperation, not confrontation. Heads nodded along as if she were teaching a lesson about democracy itself. Rachel stood tall, disciplined, but the humiliation was obvious. Megan handed her a business card with a sympathetic smile, suggesting she seek professional consultation to help navigate the transition from military command to suburban community life. The card read Legal Services HOA Compliance Specialist. To me, it looked less like an offer of help and more like a death certificate for any hope of peace in this neighborhood. I saw neighbors who had waved just days earlier now stare at Rachel like she was dangerous, a disruptive outsider who threatened their harmony. Megan had twisted that one impulsive act of shredding paper into proof that Rachel couldn't adapt to civilian life. The drive home was painfully quiet, Rachel gripping the steering wheel until her knuckles turned white. Then she exploded demanding how a corporate lawyer ended up running a suburban hole like her own fiefdom. Why hadn't anyone mentioned that our HOA president was a practicing attorney making money off the very disputes she created? Something critical was missing here, and we had no idea just how deep it went. That evening, Rachel called an old army buddy who was now an attorney in Tampa. 20 minutes into their talk, I overheard her say the words that confirmed just how much trouble we were in. Reed Legal Services wasn't just another firm. In Florida HOA circles, they were infamous for aggressive enforcement strategies, a polite way of saying they manufactured conflicts that kept lawyers busy and billing. The model was simple: the more violations they issued, the more disputes arose. The more disputes, the more legal fees on both sides. Megan wasn't just an HOA president enforcing rules. She was running a lucrative legal practice, using the neighborhood as a pipeline to create profitable conflicts. That torn-up citation had given her exactly what she needed, the perfect pretext for a drawn-out legal war, one that would rake in thousands in fees and systematically crush anyone foolish enough to challenge her. Rachel's act of defiance had walked us straight into a carefully laid trap. Megan knew exactly how to manipulate community dynamics, twist legal procedures, and use bureaucracy in her favor, always managing to appear like the reasonable one protecting the neighborhood. By Friday, our fears were confirmed. Lisa, one of the few neighbors who still dared to approach us, caught me while I was at the mailbox. She glanced around nervously, making sure Megan wasn't watching, before whispering that we needed to be careful. 3 different families had tried to fight Megan's citations in the past 2 years. Every single one of them had either been buried under crushing legal fees or forced to move away. Megan always had airtight documentation, surprise witnesses, and legal maneuvers ready to turn any challenge into a battle most people couldn't afford to fight. But why did she need such a public teachable moment? The way she emphasized that phrase earlier made it clear this wasn't about a single citation. She was setting the stage for something much bigger. Week 3 revealed her masterstroke, and as much as I despised it, I had to admit it was brilliant in its cruelty. She called an emergency community meeting, packing the center with more than 40 residents. And she used Rachel as the perfect example of what happens when someone challenges her authority. The presentation was polished like a corporate seminar. PowerPoint slides flashed across the screen showing before and after photos of compliant yards versus problem properties. Charts displayed how property values rose when rules were strictly enforced. And then came the warnings about troubling trends where residents had challenged community standards. Though Rachel's name was never mentioned, the details made it obvious: a military background, new resident, landscaping disputes. Everyone knew exactly who Megan was talking about. The audience sat there nodding, grateful that someone was protecting their investments from troublemakers who thought rules didn't apply to them. Rachel clenched her jaw as she realized she was being turned into a cautionary tale. Then came the moment everyone was waiting for: a direct confrontation. Megan paused, looked right at her, and said she understood how some newcomers might think military service excused them from civilian community standards. The deliberate contrast between military and civilian painted Rachel as an outsider who didn't belong. Rachel rose slowly, every inch of her posture disciplined, and answered in her steady command voice. She had never claimed exemption from anything, she said, and had challenged invalid citations through the proper legal channels as was her right as a citizen. Megan responded with rehearsed calm, her tone dripping with condescension. Military leadership is about issuing orders, she explained to the crowd. Civilian communities rely on consensus and cooperation. Perhaps Rachel simply needs time to adjust after years of command structures. The audience murmured their agreement, as if they were watching a teacher gently correct a stubborn student. I wanted to shout that Rachel had spent 20 years building consensus with foreign governments, managing international logistics, and keeping thousands of people alive through collaboration, but instead, I stayed silent, watching Rachel's face flush as she held her composure through sheer discipline. Megan ended with a sympathetic smile, suggesting the community would gladly help Rachel learn civilian problem-solving approaches if she was willing to adapt. The crowd applauded like they had just witnessed a masterclass in conflict resolution. The humiliation was brutal. Outside the center, neighbors who had greeted us warmly just days before now avoided eye contact. Lisa gave Rachel a sympathetic glance but quickly looked away, clearly afraid of being seen with us. The message couldn't have been clearer. This is what happens when you go against Megan Reed. You get isolated, discredited, and turned into a pariah in your own community. Rachel stood there in silence, watching familiar smiles vanish, realizing just how quickly a neighborhood can turn on you when the wrong person controls the narrative. For someone who'd spent her career building teams and earning respect through competence, the social rejection hit harder than any fine or legal threat. The drive home was worse than after the hearing. Rachel finally exploded, asking how someone gets away with that kind of public character assassination. How does a community let one person weaponize meetings to destroy anyone who disagrees with them? I didn't have good answers because honestly, I was still processing what we just witnessed. Megan had turned a simple citation dispute into a referendum on Rachel's fitness for neighborhood membership, and she'd done it so skillfully that most people probably thought they were protecting their community from a disruptive influence. That night, Rachel couldn't sleep. She paced around our house like a caged animal, muttering about due process and procedural fairness. I found her at 3 o'clock in the morning sitting at the kitchen table with her laptop, researching everything she could find about Reed Legal Services and Megan's professional background, the corporate law, real estate disputes, and HOA compliance strategies. The deeper she dug, the angrier she got. This wasn't some neighborhood volunteer gone rogue. This was a systematic business operation using community authority to generate legal fees from manufactured problems. Friday morning brought the social media assault that pushed everything into overdrive. Anonymous posts started appearing on neighborhood forums about military neighbors causing disruption. Photos of Rachel's non-compliant landscaping were shared in local groups with comments about people who thought rules didn't apply to them. The posts were carefully worded to avoid direct accusations, but the message was unmistakable. Rachel Blake was a problem that needed community action to resolve. The comments piled up quickly, neighbors sharing their own concerns about maintaining property values and community standards. Rachel spent Friday refreshing her phone like an addiction, watching the character assassination unfold in real time. Every comment felt like another punch. Neighbors she barely met weighing in about her attitude and behavior. The worst part was how reasonable it all sounded when stripped of context. Nobody mentioned Megan's legal background or financial incentives. Nobody talked about the pattern of targeted enforcement against anyone with nice yards or independent attitudes. Just concerned neighbors protecting their investments from someone who couldn't follow simple rules. Saturday brought my breakthrough discovery that changed how we understood everything. I was doing yard work when I overheard Megan on another business call, this time with someone she called Dad. She was explaining how the Blake situation was developing perfectly, creating exactly the kind of test case they needed to demonstrate firm enforcement. The community was rallying behind traditional authority, property values were being protected, and the precedent would discourage future challenges. But then she said something that made my blood freeze. She mentioned how military backgrounds could create security concerns, especially for someone consulting with defense contractors. She'd done research on Rachel's clearance status and current work situation. I realized that Megan's investigation had gone far beyond HOA violations. She'd been building a comprehensive profile of Rachel's professional life, looking for pressure points that went way beyond neighborhood politics. Why would an HOA president need to know about defense contractor relationships? What did security clearances have to do with landscaping citations? I had this sinking feeling that we were about to find out just how deep Megan's resources went and how far she was willing to push to make her point. But why did Megan seem to know so much about Rachel's work with defense contractors when that information wasn't exactly public knowledge? And how did she find out about the law firm that specialized in HOA disputes when Rachel had just learned about that connection herself? Week 4 brought the nightmare I never saw coming. Rachel still held a secret clearance for consulting work with defense contractors, helping them streamline logistics operations using military expertise. It wasn't glamorous work, but it kept her connected to the world she understood and provided decent supplemental income during retirement. Her annual clearance renewal was pending routine approval when the letter arrived that changed everything. Federal Security Review notification. Rachel's consulting contracts were immediately frozen, pending an investigation into citizen security concerns that had been filed regarding her pattern of hostility towards civilian authority figures and potential security risks. The morning that the letter arrived, I watched my wife read it 3 times before the words sank in. Someone had reported her to federal security agencies, documenting what they called escalating behavior and inability to accept civilian oversight. The report suggested potential security risks with someone who demonstrated such hostility to lawful authority structures. Rachel sat at our kitchen table, hands trembling slightly, and read the key phrases out loud: pattern of confrontational behavior toward community leadership, documented incidents of resistance, potential inability to comply with oversight requirements. The report continued with phrases like resistance to legitimate regulatory compliance and concerning attitudes toward civilian legal processes. Every line was deliberately crafted to make Rachel look like someone whose loyalty and judgment couldn't be trusted. For the first time in 3 decades of marriage, I watched my wife collapse under the weight of it. This was the same woman who had survived rocket attacks in Afghanistan, who had kept supply lines moving through hostile terrain, who had negotiated with foreign governments under pressure. Now, she was being dismantled by something as absurd as a neighborhood dispute. Rachel kept repeating that everything she had worked for was being stripped away, decades of sacrifice, discipline, and service, all reduced to nothing over a few $100s in landscaping fines. I tried to reassure her, but what do you say when your partner's entire career and identity are being shredded by someone she barely even knew? The security review process was designed to be overwhelming. Rachel was forced to explain every incident, every decision, and every confrontation, while investigators sifted through the narrative Megan had carefully pieced together. These weren't neighbors with petty complaints to federal reviewers. This was evidence. Patterns of hostility, documented resistance, testimonies from concerned residents. On paper, Rachel appeared to be exactly the kind of risk the system was meant to identify. That week nearly destroyed us. Rachel blamed herself for refusing to back down, for letting pride steer her into a fight she couldn't win, for risking everything over principle. I blamed myself for failing to see the trap and for not shielding her from Megan's carefully engineered web. We argued bitterly about whether to just pay the fines and save her clearance, or keep resisting and risk losing everything. She said surrendering meant giving power to a bully. I said her pride was about to ruin our financial security. Neither of us slept. We were both furious, terrified, and completely outmatched. Then came the discovery that changed everything. While digging through public records to trace financial ties between the HOA and local contractors, I found the proof we had been missing. Reed Construction, owned by Megan's father Richard Reed, had received more than $200,000 in community improvement contracts from the HOA over just 3 years. The timing lined up perfectly with the surge in citation activity and aggressive enforcement. The pattern was brilliant and legal. Megan would target residents with citations that required costly corrections. And the work? It just happened to go straight to Reed Construction. The community contracts were nothing more than a carefully disguised revenue stream. Reed Construction, owned by Richard Reed, had secured over $200,000 worth of projects from the HOA in just a few years. Each citation against residents seemed to line up perfectly with new contracts, making it obvious that the so-called violations were fueling a profitable cycle. The pattern was ruthless but cleverly legal. Homeowners were fined, forced into costly fixes, and those repairs funneled straight into Reed Construction's business. If anyone pushed back, Reed Legal Services was waiting, turning disputes into prolonged legal battles that only generated more billable hours. For Megan, being HOA president wasn't community service, it was a calculated business move, one that brought in hundreds of thousands every year for her family's empire. But what made the entire scheme insidious was the way she weaponized federal security procedures. She knew exactly how to target Rachel's consulting career, how to press the right buttons that would trigger federal suspicion. Defense contractors wouldn't risk ties with anyone under investigation, no matter how flimsy the accusations. Even if Rachel cleared her review in the end, the damage to her reputation and professional relationships would already be done. Megan wasn't just sabotaging our finances or social standing, she was deliberately dismantling the legacy Rachel had built through 2 decades of service. That night, Rachel finally broke. She wanted to give in completely, pay every fine, apologize publicly, and try to show investigators that she was no longer a risk. To her, surrender seemed like the only way to protect her clearance. I understood her logic, but I couldn't bear to watch my wife stripped of her dignity piece by piece. Our argument that night was the worst in our marriage. She shouted that I didn't understand what was at stake, that her career, her identity, her sense of purpose all depended on her clearance. I shouted back that she was letting a bully win, and that surrendering would only embolden Megan to destroy more families. We both said things we regretted, and by the end of it, Rachel slept in the guest room while I lay awake, wondering if our marriage could survive the storm. The next morning brought a spark of hope from an unexpected source. Lisa knocked on our door carrying a thick folder she had been building for months. Inside was damning evidence, financial records linking citations to construction contracts, emails tying Reed Legal Services directly to HOA enforcement actions, even recorded calls where Megan openly discussed strategies for generating profit from manufactured disputes. Lisa had been gathering proof all along, waiting for someone with enough credibility and courage to finally take a stand against the corruption. But the pressure on Rachel only grew heavier. With the federal investigation dragging on, her consulting contracts frozen, and stress consuming her, she began packing away her military memorabilia as if preparing to leave that life behind. I found her holding her Bronze Star, sobbing in a way I had never seen before. She whispered that maybe Megan was right, that maybe military people really couldn't adjust to suburban civilian life. I held her as she cried, but inside, I knew something didn't add up. Megan seemed far too confident about federal clearance reviews, almost as if she knew things she shouldn't. Why would a neighborhood HOA president have detailed knowledge about which agencies handled federal investigations? And why was she so certain law enforcement would always side with her version of events? The breaking point came when Megan herself showed up at our doorstep with yet another violation, at this time claiming Rachel had intimidated HOA staff. Neighbors stood outside, phones raised, ready to capture the moment. Megan projected herself as the calm authority, loudly declaring that Rachel's behavior had escalated to the point where police involvement was unavoidable. Rachel, standing tall with her military composure back in place, told her flatly that she had followed every rule and endured months of harassment without retaliation. But Megan spun the narrative flawlessly, painting Rachel as unstable, a veteran unable to respect civilian authority. With theatrical precision, she dialed 911 for everyone to hear, reporting that a resident with military training was posing a threat to community leaders. When the police arrived, Megan was ready. She handed them her thick folder of records of complaints, violation notices, even the federal investigation paperwork, as if it were undeniable proof of Rachel's instability. To the officers, it must have looked like they were dealing with a dangerous case. when in reality it was nothing more than a manufactured web designed to destroy my wife's life. Megan positioned herself as a responsible community leader, claiming she was dealing with a resident whose military past made them potentially unpredictable in civilian disputes. To the crowd, Rachel appeared exactly as Megan had described, a worn down, defensive, and guilty based on the stack of records Megan had presented. Officer Hayes examined the documents with growing concern, noting what seemed like a pattern of confrontational behavior. It aligned with textbook descriptions of veterans struggling to adapt to civilian authority. He began following standard procedure, asking Rachel for her account while Officer Harris carefully logged everything for the report. Neighbors stood by, cameras raised, expecting to see justice delivered against someone they believed had disturbed their peaceful community. Then came the turning point. Hayes asked Rachel for her identification, a routine protocol. Rachel silently handed him her driver's license, her posture showing defeat and resignation. As Hayes glanced at the ID and then back at her face, his expression changed within seconds. His body language shifted from routine professionalism to something entirely different, and the silence stretched long enough for everyone to notice. Then he spoke the words that shattered Megan's carefully built image. "The broken bar, General Blake." His tone carried respect, instantly undermining everything Megan had spent weeks constructing. Confused murmurs spread through the crowd as phones continued to record. Megan's confident mask cracked, realizing the situation had just turned against her. Recognition filled Hayes's voice as he asked if Rachel was the same General Blake who had overseen supply operations at Forward Operating Base Chapman in Afghanistan back in 2013. Rachel, steady and dignified, confirmed that she had served at Chapman, but reminded him to continue with his duty, insisting that here, she was just another citizen. But Hayes couldn't hold back his respect. He recalled how her leadership during the convoy attacks had saved his entire unit when supply lines were under siege. The admiration in his voice was unmistakable, and the neighbors who had once believed Megan's story were now seeing a completely different truth about Rachel. Megan scrambled to regain control, demanding to know who this general was supposed to be. But Hayes's eyes were already scanning her paperwork differently. Suddenly, inconsistencies jumped out at timestamps that didn't match complaint dates, witness statements written with suspiciously identical wording, and complaints filed in batches rather than individually, suggesting coordination instead of genuine concern. Officer Harris confirmed the irregularities, and both officers now saw the case in a new light. Hayes concluded that no crime had taken place. What they were dealing with wasn't a violent resident but a civil conflict with a strong indication of harassment directed at Rachel, not by her. The neighbors who had been waiting for Rachel's arrest instead watched her vindication unfold in real time. Phones that had been raised to capture her humiliation were now documenting the unraveling of Megan's scheme. Hayes asked Rachel if she wanted assistance in dealing with ongoing harassment, offering resources to track and report patterns of targeted enforcement. He even advised her to take future complaints to county officials if the HOA continued its baseless actions. The shift was swift and devastating. Megan's months of scheming collapsed in a matter of minutes, destroyed by a single recognition of who Rachel truly was. But it also raised questions. So why had Hayes recognized her as General Blake when the neighborhood only knew her as Mrs. Harland? And what exactly had happened at FOB Chapman in 2013 that commanded such deep respect from a police officer? The aftermath spread like wildfire. Multiple videos of the confrontation hit the internet within hours. By the afternoon, one clip had 500,000 views and was climbing rapidly. Comment sections overflowed with support for Rachel. Military families amplified the story, outraged that a decorated general had been tormented by what people now dubbed an HOA Karen. The hashtag #HOA Karen began trending, and by evening, national news outlets were reporting on the story. Captivated by the David versus Goliath tale of neighborhood politics gone horribly wrong, the story spread like wildfire across social media platforms, drawing thousands of comments from veterans and civilians who had their own HOA nightmare experiences. Most common were phrases like "Go General," "Karen got owned," and "Justice at last." Rachel eventually asked me to stop reading the comments aloud, but I couldn't deny the relief. It felt like we could finally breathe again after 6 relentless weeks of watching her reputation be torn apart. The online community had made its judgment, and they were firmly on Rachel's side. Meghan immediately tried to contain the damage by issuing a statement through her legal team. She insisted she hadn't known about Rachel's military service and claimed she was only following normal HOA procedures. Her statement argued that military service didn't exempt anyone from neighborhood rules and insisted all actions had been fair and professional. But the public wasn't convinced. Soon, people began uncovering financial ties between HOA enforcement and the Reed family's construction business, which had generated hundreds of thousands of dollars in profits through citations and repair contracts. That Sunday, Lisa organized an emergency neighborhood meeting at the community center called Support Our Neighbors. The turnout was overwhelming. Families who had stayed silent out of fear now came forward, sharing their own horror stories about Meghan's leadership. Rachel naturally stepped into a role of guidance, helping Mr. Patterson with VA paperwork, organizing a community cleanup day, and translating complicated HOA bylaws into plain language so everyone understood their actual rights. It was during this gathering that my own research came into the spotlight. I presented financial records clearly showing how violation notices directly lined up with profitable reconstruction contracts. The pattern was undeniable. Families would be cited for things like landscaping violations, forced to make costly corrections, and when they resisted, they'd face escalating legal threats from Reed Legal Services. For Meghan, HOA presidency wasn't about community service, it was a revenue machine for the Reed family. The neighborhood's response was immediate. More than 50 residents signed a petition backing Rachel and demanding a recall election to remove Meghan as president. To make sure the process couldn't be twisted by selective enforcement, Lisa was elected interim secretary, guaranteeing fairness and proper procedure. Years of silence finally broke as people stood up, recounting stories of extortionate fines, forced contractor work, and the climate of intimidation that had defined the neighborhood. The pressure only intensified when local news outlets picked up the story. Channel 7 announced a special feature on veterans being targeted by HOA officials, framing it as a David versus Goliath story that resonated with countless viewers tired of bureaucratic abuse. Rachel gave her interview with calm professionalism, explaining she had only ever wanted fair treatment and never imagined a simple landscaping dispute would spiral into something so serious. Meghan, on the other hand, refused interviews and stuck to carefully worded statements through her lawyer, statements that only made her look defensive and disconnected. Journalists kept digging, uncovering more details about Reed Construction's suspiciously profitable contracts and the web of financial incentives driving HOA enforcement. The following day, Meghan's father, Richard Reed, stepped in. He called an emergency meeting, and neighbors overheard heated arguments through open windows. He spelled out the damage the viral video had caused. Reed Construction was losing contracts, Reed Legal Services was bleeding clients, and their entire enforcement scheme was now a public relations disaster threatening decades of business across Florida. The recall election was officially scheduled, with proper notice filed under Florida HOA regulations. Meghan's grip on power was slipping fast, and for the first time, the community felt like victory was possible. Meghan could have dragged things out through legal maneuvers and procedural delays, but she made the calculated choice to accept the community's judgment rather than prolong a battle she was clearly losing. Her official statement was carefully crafted, acknowledging that perhaps it was time for new leadership with fresh ideas, but avoiding any direct admission of wrongdoing. She framed her exit as a gracious respect for democratic processes rather than a defeat. By Wednesday, the community gathered for a pivotal meeting. Meghan delivered a carefully written apology, one clearly designed by legal advisors. She admitted to overreach, but in language that protected her from liability. She addressed Rachel and others who felt unfairly singled out, insisting that true leadership required listening to residents, not just enforcing rules. It was a strategic retreat, intended more to protect her reputation than to express sincere regret. Rachel's response, however, stood out. With calm military composure, she accepted the apology gracefully and reminded everyone that the neighborhood was stronger when people worked together instead of against one another. She declined a nomination to run for HOA president, choosing instead to serve in an advisory role that would help build transparent systems without the burden of administrative duties. The contrast between the two women was striking. Meghan appeared defensive and calculating, while Rachel radiated quiet strength and integrity. When the votes were counted, the results were decisive. 72% of households supported Meghan's removal, and Lisa was elected interim president with 68% backing her. The new leadership wasted no time implementing reforms: transparent enforcement processes, homeowner input on major decisions, fair appeals procedures, and independent financial audits. Freed from intimidation, the community began to thrive. Property values actually went up, not down, proving that fair leadership worked better than fear-driven control. But questions lingered. Why had the viral video reached 500,000 views in just 2 hours? And what exactly had Meghan's father meant when he warned her to fix this before it destroyed their business? What business ties were truly at risk? The following Monday brought an unexpected twist. Meghan approached Rachel privately outside the community center, and no cameras, no audience, just two women face to face. She asked if they could speak professionally, woman to woman, about ending the conflict without further escalation. Rachel agreed, curious to hear what Meghan had planned now that her power had crumbled. The negotiation that followed was blunt but surprisingly pragmatic. Meghan admitted to letting her pride interfere with her judgment during enforcement. Rachel countered that targeting someone's military clearance over yard disputes crossed a line that could never be erased. Meghan proposed they move toward a professional resolution instead of endless conflict. The terms were set like a business contract. Meghan would publicly acknowledge her mistakes and push for policy reforms. Reed Construction would surrender all remaining HOA contracts to avoid conflicts of interest. All fines against Rachel and other homeowners would be voided. In return, Rachel agreed not to pursue lawsuits or press the federal harassment issue further, recognizing that while Meghan's actions were unethical, they had stayed just within legal boundaries. At the next home meeting, residents packed the room to see the final chapter of 6 chaotic weeks. Meghan read her prepared statement, carefully acknowledging missteps while steering clear of legal admissions. It was the official close of a bitter chapter, but not without leaving unanswered questions about the true scale of the Reed family's business empire. Meghan framed her final statement carefully, presenting it not as an admission of defeat but as an act of leadership, acknowledging that true governance meant listening to community voices instead of simply enforcing rules. Her words were constructed to shield her legally while portraying her exit as a respectful nod to democratic values rather than the collapse of her authority. Rachel's reply showed the calm strength that had defined her military career. She accepted the apology with professionalism and stressed that their community thrived when neighbors worked together instead of fighting against each other. She chose not to run for HOA president, instead offering to serve in an advisory role, helping design transparent systems without being burdened by administrative duties. The difference between Rachel's authenticity and Meghan's careful maneuvering was striking, and the residents recognized it immediately. The recall vote left no doubt, and Meghan was removed from her position with overwhelming support, and Lisa was chosen as interim president. The new leadership wasted no time introducing reforms, transparent enforcement rules, mandatory community input for major decisions, fair appeals processes, and annual financial audits to eliminate conflicts of interest. Within weeks, the neighborhood transformed. Property values rose as families felt safe to invest in their homes without fearing arbitrary penalties. Community gatherings were lively again, free of the tension that had hung over every interaction during Meghan's presidency. New residents were greeted with simple, straightforward guidelines rather than intimidation. Rachel flourished as a homeowner advocate, guiding families through HOA processes, using her military background to connect veterans with resources, and organizing appreciation events. The investigation into her security clearance was quietly dropped after federal officials realized it had been fueled by misleading claims. Meghan, though diminished, adapted strategically. She redirected her legal skills toward zoning and permit support, offering help while staying out of direct HOA operations. It wasn't redemption in the truest sense but rather an attempt to rebuild credibility after her very public downfall. The ultimate test came when a new family moved in with big landscaping plans. This time, Instead of threats and fines, the process unfolded with cooperation, Elisa welcoming them with clear information, Rachel offering guidance, and Megan assisting with permit details. The collaboration highlighted how much the community had changed, intimidation replaced by teamwork. Months later, Rachel's influence spread beyond their neighborhood. Other HOA communities across Florida reached out for her advice on fair governance. What had begun as a local conflict had become a model for reform, teaching homeowners to resist abuse of authority and demand accountability. The community's transformation was celebrated at a barbecue funded by money once wasted on legal battles. For the first time in years, families laughed, ate, and played together without fear of retaliation. Officer Hayes came not as law enforcement, but as a friend. Even Megan attended, keeping her distance but participating as just another neighbor. Rachel learned that civilian leadership required patience and cooperation rather than command. Megan discovered that true influence came from service instead of control, and the entire neighborhood realized they never had to accept intimidation from those in power. My reflection on those turbulent weeks is simple. The greatest victories don't come from crushing your opponent but from creating systems where everyone benefits. Rachel hadn't set out to let us, she only wanted fairness. Megan hadn't aimed to become a tyrant as she was struggling to rebuild her career. Yet when their paths collided, the clash revealed unexpected strength, resilience, and growth. Rachel could have surrendered quietly, but she chose instead to stand for what was right, inspiring an entire community to demand fairness. Sometimes, even rivals can become unlikely partners in building something better. But why had Megan accepted the settlement terms so quickly? And what did she mean when she said they were both strong women who had simply miscommunicated? It almost hinted at a deeper understanding between them that others never saw. Stories like this are exactly what we share here on Anna Dramanesto, where ordinary people become extraordinary when they refuse to bow to injustice. If this story connected with you, don't forget to like and share your thoughts in the comments. See you next time with another powerful tale of justice and resilience.